have a great interview because your grandma's so interesting?
Yes, it's going to be so good.
I'll lie a lot and make it look interesting. How's that?
Okay.
I grew up in Kansas City, Missouri. I grew up during the Depression. Nobody had any money. I mean, really not. My mother and father both worked. My father was going to school at the same time, trying to get his master's degree. I had to have babysitters. And in the summertime, I spent my time in Kansas at my grandparents' place. My grandparents were there, and my aunt and uncle in the big house. They had their own garden, and they grew chickens. So I watched the chickens hatch from their shells, and I watched them kind of grow up. And then we ate them. How's that? My grandfather, he engraved tombstones. That was his business. And people kept dying, but they weren't paying because they didn't have any money. So everybody was poor, you know. The Depression was hard on people. My mother got tuberculosis, and she had to go to a sanitarium, and so my grandmother was supposed to stay and help us, but my grandmother was kind of a gypsy, and she left one day. So I was the only one who could really even begin to cook. So I took over, you know, I took over in the household, or whatever you want to call it.
How old were you at this time?
I think 11. I could show you a group of pictures of me, and you could easily pick out which one was during that time, because even my face was thin. And I wanted to make good grades so my mother would be proud of me. And I both wrote her a letter every day. So I was a busy girl.
Were you allowed to visit her at the sanitarium or no?
Occasionally. It was a train ride. It was at the beginning of the Second World War. We had seats because we got on at the beginning of the line, but the aisles were filled with soldiers in their uniforms going to whatever place they were going. I remember that. When my mother came home was feeling better, she took over the cooking, and I'm sure my dad was very happy to have her back, because he couldn't cook at all. I have to tell you what my first pet was. There was a little black cat that showed up at that school, and so I asked my dad if I could have it, and he said yes. And then I took it home, and my mother said, tomorrow that cat leaves. And there was a terrible snowstorm that night, so the cat never left because she didn't have the heart to kick him out in the middle of a snowstorm. When I moved around a lot was after I got married, and Wally was in the Navy, and that was the Korean War. We met in college. I went to Kansas University, and so did he. We met at a tea dance. Sororities and fraternities met sometimes for afternoon dances, and that's a tea dance. I don't think they serve tea, but Coke or something, you know. He asked me for a date, and I wasn't sure about him. He was kind of different. But if you say yes to a date, if you're in a sorority or fraternity, you have to go. So when I went, I took money with me in case I didn't like him very much, so I could get a cab and go back home. I don't know, he was just different, kind of with a chip on his back. Have you ever heard that?
Yeah, I've heard that
shoulder.
before.
Yeah, on his shoulder. That's kind of the way I saw him. even before I really met him, but I never met anybody like that before. He liked to hunt, and my dad liked to hunt. We actually had quite a bit to talk about. And he turned out to be a lot of fun, to tell you the truth. He was a good dancer, and I liked to dance. And he had allergies, and I had allergies. So we spent the summer going to movies because it was air conditioned in the movies. I quit college when we got engaged and all that stuff. I was getting ready to go into journalism, but I had no idea what I was getting into. So I was engaged to Wally, and so the hell with it, you know. My dad cried, I'll tell you that. We traveled a lot while he was in the Navy. A lot of different states, and then we ended up in where he started out, at Officer Candidate School in Newport, Rhode Island, and he was teaching there. Very different than any place I ever lived before. The people were different, and they went to hoity-toity schools like Yale and Harvard and Princeton. And one time at a cocktail party, some guy said, well, Wally will never go very far because he doesn't have a degree from our schools. And I said, well, he had a scholarship to Princeton, but he didn't want to move back east, so he didn't take it. And I thought, I wish now I could go to a cocktail party with that same guy and say, yeah. I mean, he did go far, aren't you surprised? Right after we got out of the Navy, my first child was born, and that was Shauna. We came back to Kansas City. That's where Wally wanted to live because he hunted, on farms in Kansas, and that was really the life he liked. When we moved back to Kansas City, I discovered this church, and it was already big. There were several thousand people who belonged to it. I wanted to join, and my neighbor had kids the age of my little girls, and she went with me when we enrolled in the church or whatever the hell you do. So you have to sign a card that says how you're going to contribute your labor, you know. And so we joined the choir. When I moved to St. Louis, they were starting a new church, and so that's where I started working and teaching in the church, in the Sunday school, actually. The minister was our friend, and we had other friends that we just kind of were a group. And so we entertained each other in each other's homes and went to plays together and stuff like that. I started doing it more for my kids because I wanted them to have be brought up in the church. Your dad is 10 years younger than his sisters. So we were living in Chicago when he was born. It was with having 3 kids, and Wally was traveling, a traveling salesman. I didn't have very much help, most of the time. Then I discovered that I liked teaching, and I went back to college when we lived in Chicago. Your father had 2 older sisters, and they just loved him to death, and they liked taking care of him and playing with him and stuff like that. So I'm sure Shauna was the oldest, so she did most of that, and Charlie just watched and learned, So my mother came to help me take care of him so I could go back to college. They had a pretty good relationship. Wally didn't like living in Chicago. It was too hard to go hunting when he lived there. I don't think you want to tell your teacher that he started drinking. It was very unpleasant, but it's the truth. He eventually started his own business, plastic bags, and moved to Columbus, Ohio. We divorced because he was gone. I mean, why pretend? And so he lived in Ohio and we lived in Chicago. And I was getting upset by some of this. You don't have to repeat this. Some of the stuff that the teenagers were doing, some of the stuff that Shauna did, actually, I really had strict rules for her. And when she went out, she had to tell me where she was going, at night. And if she changed places, she had to call me. But the boys were very impressed with that. They thought, she was really well brought up. So, and she did agree to do it. At first she thought she didn't want to, and I said, Shauna, how would you like to be lying in a ditch somewhere and nobody knows where you are? So she thought about that for 2 or 3 days, and then she said, you're right. And she stuck with it.
Mm-hmm. A lot of people weren't divorced, particularly where we were from, in that neighborhood. What was that like for you at that point?
I really didn't have that much of a problem with people in the neighborhood of the church because I was divorced. Because my kids were so shining examples, and they'd read about them in the newspaper and how they made the honor roll time after time, and how can you be mean to a person whose kids are doing that well? You see what I mean? That was the biggest thing where we lived in Chicago, was education. Everybody felt the same way about it. And when you do well in education, which you did, people respect you. I wanted to go get a teacher's certificate, and I wanted to teach. I substituted for a while. They hired me at the school where I ended up in, Buffalo Grove. I taught kids with learning disabilities, and it was all new to me. I liked it. I liked the kids always, and those kids were just really good. They weren't horribly disabled, and they really wanted to do well, and they had a great attitude, and sure, I loved it. It goes back to something else you said. I went pretty far in the church. I was a deacon, if you would believe that. And all the teaching and meetings and all that stuff, they're what you do. They're like what you do when you're working outside the home. So it wasn't all, that didn't bother me. It bothered me to go back to school, though, I can tell you, because I had lost all my mnemonic devices and everything had changed, and you were computers, and you had to remember your damn Social Security number. So that's how they listed your grades. I still know 497344088. How's that?
Great.
And I don't know the date, so what is it worth? I really wanted to do it. I wanted to do it when I first went to college at KU, and my dad wouldn't let me. By the time Easter vacation was over, they told us not to teach these kids anything new because they weren't in the mood to learn it, just to review what we had done throughout the year. And so what I decided to do was have a puppet show where the kids would make the puppets, and I made the costumes, and I had to write the play. Then they took the puppets and had them move around on the stage and stuff. But then they got to keep the puppets when the show was over. Coming back after Easter break, the room started looking adorable with these puppets in there. The kids loved it, and I loved it. See, I don't think that in our school people were very nice to the kids that were in LD, especially the music teacher. And and stuff like that. And it's really stupid because we had kids who were wonderful singers and wonderful actresses. In fact, one little girl came back after she was in junior high school, and she said, "I came back to thank you because you gave me a chance." I think you have to kind of try to find out what you want to do in life, and then don't let anybody discourage you. You just have to, because you know yourself better than anybody knows you, right? And I just think you should work to decide what you're going to do with your life, and then you be very brave and work hard, and you accomplish it. I think my proudest accomplishment is my children and my grandchildren. Like you, for instance, right? I was an only child, and I wanted kids and big family, and I got it. So